Welcome to the Desert Sanctuary with Carl and Laura Forehand.
Often when we have doubts about religion or simply want to ask questions, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert.
We would like to invite you to join our sanctuary, the Desert Sanctuary.
We've tried to pick guests that would resonate with and challenge us and our fellow seekers here in the desert.
We believe that a key to the journey is to keep asking good questions, and we believe that all stories are sacred.
Our hope is that you will find life and healing for your body and mind, and that you will be able to be where you are and be who you are.
And now, here is our show.
Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary podcast. I'm Laura Forehand. I'm here with Carl Forehand, and we're going to get started. We have Guy Stevens here with us today, and Guy is a passionate advocate and a nationally recognized expert on restraint and seclusion. In 2019, Guy founded the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, AASR, a highly respected national nonprofit organization. AASR's mission is to inform changes in policy and practice to reduce and eliminate the use of punitive and exclusionary discipline and outdated behavioral management approaches and end the school-to-prison pipeline. Guy promotes trauma-informed, neuroscience-aligned, neurodiversity-affirming, relationship-driven, and collaborative approaches to working with children. He has presented at conferences and events across North America and regularly speaks as a guest lecturer for undergraduate and graduate courses. Guy currently serves on the board of directors for the ARC of Maryland and PDA North America. Guy believes that we can do better for all children and adults. If we can, we must. Guy understands that we must embrace neurodiversity and neuroscience to create safe and inclusive environments and ensure equal rights and opportunities for all. Guy, welcome to the podcast. And as an educator, I am really excited about this conversation. So thank you so much for being here on the podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hoping everything goes smooth here. Jackson, our grandson, is along with us.
Yeah.
So that's going to be fine. We're going to have fun anyhow. We think stories are sacred. We really like to hear people's stories. Sometimes for us, that's abuse survivors, and different people, sometimes experts and sometimes little of both. But can you tell us your story? And it's whatever you want, however long you want to tell it. And then we'll go from there.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's interesting. When you put it in that context of story, the question is where to begin. And I'm going to begin initially with, I think, what's really relevant to probably why I'm here and sharing with you. And that's going to be a story about my family and what led me to start the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. But after that, I may share a few other things because already talking to you before we started, a few things entered my mind about stories from long ago and experiences from long ago that probably honestly have had some influence over the work that I do as well. So I'm going to start off a little later in life. I won't begin at the beginning. But I got involved in this work that I'm now doing really because of a lived experience and a personal situation. I have two children. I have my son now who is 19, my daughter who is 15, and amazing kids. My son is neurodivergent. Through school, he needed additional help and supports and, of course, had an IEP. Unfortunately, my son also experienced physical restraint and seclusion at school. I never would have imagined that physical restraint and seclusion were things that might have been done to my son before they were done to my son. I would not have imagined there were situations where a child might be held down, in some way, or put into a small empty room against their will while someone held the door shut.
Yeah.
I would not have imagined those things as practices that might have happened. But unfortunately they did happen, and it left in its wake a tremendous amount of trauma for my son and my family. I won't go through the whole history of events, but I'll share with you kind of a brief overview that the very first time that it ever was done to him, he was only 6 years old. He was on a playground. He didn't want to come in. Eventually, he ended up being physically restrained, carried in, put into an empty office. And, the words restraint and seclusion weren't used. There was no report made as our state law would have required. And unfortunately, that situation was an outlier. There was never anything like that to happen again. He was having a lot of difficulty in school at that time. And we were this is before he had any kind of formal diagnoses. But we knew when he went from kindergarten to first grade that things kind of went off the rails a bit. He was getting overwhelmed and ending up under a desk or running down a hallway. We eventually moved him into a specialized program in our county. And in hindsight, I don't know that would be my choice, but at the time it seemed like the best choice. And we moved him into this program, and it was a program that served children with different disabilities, a number of autistic children in the classroom. But he had a great team when he moved into that classroom, and very relationship driven, very, connected with him. And for the next 4 years, he made a lot of progress. In fact, from first grade until fifth grade, he eventually was almost in full inclusion by the middle to end of fifth grade. So kind of the path you might want a kid on that needed some extra help. Got some extra help, and it kind of returned to kind of a more inclusive general education setting. The end of fifth grade brought some tragedy. He had a teacher he had been working with for about 2.5 years, and she got involved in a car accident. Now, this teacher was his person, and I know that'll make sense to you.
Yep.
But meaning that if he was having a hard day or he needed some help or needed some guidance, they might have ended up behind the school, taking a walk under the power lines, or doing a number of different things. When she got involved in the accident, initially there wasn't a lot of information shared with the kids of the family. Suddenly, this person just kind of disappeared, and he was growing increasingly anxious and worried. And over time, over the next few weeks, we began to see behavior we hadn't seen for 5 years. Things like elopement, things like really becoming overwhelmed. And there were 2 occasions at the end of that fifth grade year where he eloped. He hid in a bathroom. He eventually came out only to be physically restrained, drugged down a hallway, and thrown into an empty classroom. I happened to be nearby the second time this had happened. I went to pick him up. As I got there, he was in a room, and he had thrown things, knocked things over, tried to climb out an open window. I got there about 45 minutes after the situation had begun, and he was very clearly still in a fight or flight mode, very dysregulated. And I asked everyone to leave. I sat down on the floor, waited till he was at a point that we could begin to kind of communicate and eventually leave. But these 2 situations that occurred led to a situation where he didn't feel safe going back to school. And we honestly didn't feel safe sending him back. And we began to look at options. He would have been moving into the 6th grade, so moving to middle school. We began to look at options. We looked at private schools. We looked at non-public placements. We looked at a lot of things. We even began exploring homeschooling, which is never anything that had been on our radar. We never thought about ourselves as homeschool parents. After a lot of thought and deliberation, and really hearing his voice, we kind of put the options to him, and he wanted to homeschool. He didn't feel safe going back. And we made a decision, and we made changes in our lives to accommodate homeschooling him. And we did that for the next 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, we found a good curriculum. He did well. Not to say every day was easy. Mom was doing a lot of the homeschooling, and it's an extra duty to be a parent and a homeschool teacher and all of those things. But overall, things went well. And at the end of 2 years, he had decided kind of on his own, he wanted to go back to school. We had started a little scouting type group, a group called Navigators. And he was in that group with some of his old friends. And he's like, I want to go back to school and be with my friends. And we were supportive, but concerned and cautious. I had always advocated for my son through the IEP process. I was and I hate to say this, one of the rare dads, because there aren't often a lot of dads that get involved in that. And I encourage dads to get involved in that if you're able. But I was always very involved. I'd even done some training. I'd done something called the Family Leadership Institute at one point. I did a program called Leaders. And I was fairly well versed with special education law, IEP process, all of that. But when he decided to go back, we had to requalify him for services, go back through the whole system again. And I had a lot of concern about what had happened before. So I took a lot of steps to make sure we wouldn't end up there again. Had a lot of conversations about how to better support him. And eventually we were ready to have him go back in the fall of 2018. I had met with every administrator in the building, had met with all his teachers, had developed a new IEP. He was going to go into a self-contained setting with the idea that he would move out once we knew that he was going to be successful. We never got there, though. He was in that setting for about 15 days. Over the first 15 days he was there, he was restrained and or secluded at least 4 times. We think it was even more than that. The school only officially reported 2 instances, and that was only when I put pressure on them to do so. And that led to a situation where after 15 days, there was a particularly traumatic event, and he was back to where he was. He was not going to go back to school. He was afraid to go back to school, and we were terrified to send him back. So here we are with a kid that is afraid to go back to school. We advocated for what's called home and hospital, might be called homebound in other states, but a provision of the IEP process, the individual education plan process, that will allow a teacher educator to come out to your house a couple days a week to work with your child. The school agreed. We were very lucky here. They selected for us a man who had been teaching for about 50 years. You can do the math there. He was in his 70s. Steve, now many years later, is a family friend, a friend of my son's. But Steve came over to our house the first couple of times and did nothing but work on building a relationship. Got to know my son, who he was, what he liked, what he didn't like. Steve ended up working with my son for the remainder of that school year. We kind of kept him in that home and hospital setting as we were trying to figure out what to do next. And Steve built a relationship that, like I said, is alive and well today. Cooper is coming back from college soon and is talking about going to Steve's to do some work and say hello. He built some bird houses he wants to put up on his property. So, that was a positive experience, but we were still stuck at what do we do next? And ultimately, we went to a non-public placement where he finished he completed high school in a non-public setting, a very non-traditional setting. But from there, this instance of him being restrained and secluded again, there is no federal law around the use of seclusion and restraint in schools around the nation. There are federal laws in healthcare, in law enforcement, but nothing in our school settings. And what that means is every state is on their own in terms of what their laws say or don't say. I happen to live in a state, Maryland, which had at the time some of the better laws in the nation. They had followed a lot of the federal guidance that had been provided previously. However, despite the fact that we had stronger laws, my son was restrained and secluded in ways that really did not meet the definition of the law. Our law was very clear that you wouldn't do these things unless it was a crisis situation. You've tried everything else you can try, and it's needed to avoid the threat of imminent, serious physical harm. And imminent, serious physical harm, interestingly enough, has a legal definition. And it's not simply an unsafe situation. It is a potentially life-threatening situation. That's what federal guidance says. That's what our state law said. My son was restrained and secluded once because he splashed water, once because he squirted hand sanitizer on the floor. Nothing that should have resulted in these things being done to him, but they were done, and they led to a lot of trauma. And from there, here my son, initially was out of school. We weren't sure what we were going to do. I knew what had happened shouldn't have happened. I had a conversation with him, and I said, "This is not okay. What was done to you is not okay." And I made him a promise, and the promise was very, very simple. My promise was, I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure this doesn't happen to you again or other kids like you. This is not okay. I wouldn't have thought then that promise would lead me down a road where I eventually decided to leave a job I'd been at for over 20 years and start a nonprofit to try to create change. But it's exactly what happened. I began doing a lot of research, trying to understand why these things were happening, who they were happening to, what we could do differently. And that's really what began my journey into, kind of, as you said earlier, those trauma-informed approaches, those neuroscience-aligned approaches. kind of neurodiversity affirming approaches. When I did the research, of course, what I very quickly found was that kids that were more likely being restrained and secluded were children with disabilities,
Right.
black and brown children, neurodivergent children, kids with an existing trauma history. More often than not, very, very young kids. My son was an outlier at his age. He was 13 when this last happened to him. Most of the kids that this happens to are 6 and 7 years old. So knowing the who, I began to try to understand the why. Why were these things happening, and then what the impact of them was. And of course, what I found is that a lot of what we were doing in the name of behavior wasn't working for kids that really needed help the most. And, I looked at the impact, and of course, the impact is significant trauma. There's a blind spot often for systemic trauma. And I know you spend a lot of time talking about systems, but, systems of care, religious systems, there are systems that people don't associate with trauma that, in fact, can cause significant and long-lasting trauma. And my son was kind of a victim of that. So, you understand trauma, and I guess that led me down a very deep rabbit hole of trying to understand trauma. That led me down kind of understanding the neuroscience behind behavior, but understanding that kids are traumatized, they're injured, and they die.
Yeah.
I found in 2009 there was a government accountability report. So the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, did a study generating a report. The report was titled, and this title even kind of sends chills down my spine: Seclusion and Restraint, Selected Instances of Death and Abuse at Public and Private Schools and Treatment Centers. They found hundreds of cases of potential abuse and death due to the use of restraint and seclusion happening in schools. And in fact, in 2019, in 2018, at the same time this was last done to my son, across the country in California, a young man named Max Benson, 13 years old, like my son, autistic, like my son, like science, like nature, like collecting things, like my son. He was put into a prone restraint at school that killed him. I have met some members of his family. I have a volunteer on our team that was a neighbor of the family. It's tragic. It's absolutely tragic, and it's avoidable. The Alliance really began focused on restraint and seclusion, but the more we went into looking at all of this, the broader it is. It's not just restraint and seclusion. It's restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. We still have 17 states that allow you to hit a kid in school in the name of discipline, despite a lot of knowledge about the harm that it can cause. So at any rate, the Alliance began kind of initially from that experience with my son. I advocated for change locally. I worked with our school system. We were able to change the policy and the practice at our school system. Turns out that my school district, in the state of Maryland, we have about 23 school districts. My district at the time was number 1 in the state in the use of seclusion, number 2 in the state in the use of restraint. They were using these things at a far higher rate. And I know why now. I didn't know why then. And the why is culture and training. It's how people are often led to believe they need to handle certain situations. It's how they're trained. It's punitive and exclusionary culture as well. So at any rate, all of this kind of led to a journey of learning. I began finding and connecting with people from really all over the world. I mean, this work, it really does take you everywhere. I had a conversation with a colleague in Australia earlier today from Brain Institute. This work really does connect you with people kind of from all over the world. And, I was finding people like, Mona Delahooke and Laurie Desautel and Dan Siegel and, Dr. Stephen Porges. And, I was finding all of this research. I came from a science background. My background was in biology, environmental science. I worked for a university. I'd been in a job for, a couple of decades. I had no intent of any of this, but, as I started this work, I kind of realized that there was a need. I knew that I would do whatever I could to make sure that my son was going to be okay. But there's a lot of kids that don't have anybody in their corner. And as I realized that, I reached a point where this work began to expand. And suddenly I found myself in a position where essentially I had 2 full-time jobs, because I had a full-time job, and then suddenly the Alliance had grown into a second full-time job. And I reached a point where I realized that I couldn't do that. And I guess if I had been more rational and logical, I would have said, well, gee, I guess I need to stop doing all this work with the Alliance. I mean, it's volunteer work. It's not, it's not paying my mortgage, and I should just focus on my career. But I couldn't do that. I felt too compelled by this work, and made a decision to leave my job, and put in a 6-month notice, and ultimately left my job and have started this nonprofit. And fortunately, we've been able to, find ways to bring in some revenue to help us continue this work. But it's hard. I mean, we're a small nonprofit, but we're a small nonprofit trying to have a big impact. So that's kind of the origin of this work that I'm involved in. And of course, it is really about kind of 3 things that we do. We do a lot of work around laws and policies, trying to influence, whether at a local level, a state level, a federal level. I've worked with lawmakers across the country trying to support better legislation, better policy, work with individual schools and districts as well. But that part to me is less important than the second thing we do, which is around education, which is how do we, it's not enough to say don't do these things and don't do these things, they're harmful. We've got to share with people what are the better things we can and should do. How do we better support not only the kids, but also teachers and staff? And I've come to appreciate that the same things that we can do to improve outcomes for kids can improve outcomes for teachers and staff. So we do a lot of work in education. That means doing, like, we do podcasts, we do conferences and speak to graduate, undergraduate courses. We've got a little mini online conference coming up in January. I actually worked in a very unusual partnership. We ended up collaborating with Crisis Prevention Institute, which is a company that trains people in crisis management and restraint. And it's a whole interesting story there that I won't go into, but the upshot of it is we began collaborating around shared goals. Turns out that they were aligned with us in eliminating seclusion. They were aligned with us in reducing the use of restraint. And we worked with them to develop a whole new program called Reframing Behavior that now is rolling out to schools across the nation, which I'm really excited and proud about. I mean, it was a lot of work to develop that. But, our mission is really, how can we bring some of this information, this, kind of neuroscience-aligned and trauma-informed information to schools, to educators, and make a positive difference. So I'll pause there for a second because I can go on and on, but that's kind of the part of my story about how I went from kind of a different path in my life to suddenly realizing that there was a need out there, and making a shift into doing work that I'm very passionate about and hopeful in terms of affecting changes that improve outcomes for people.
Well, as you were talking, I mean, as an educator, it's hard for me to hear those stories, but what's even harder is the fact that I've worked in 3 school districts. One for sure where I've actually sadly not actually witnessed it, but it was the seclusion and restraint was happening in a classroom. And,
It's traumatic.
it's
for
very,
everybody.
it's,
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
I don't want to minimize the trauma on that student. I can't even imagine, because you had in this classroom, probably 3 or 4 police officers. And this student was no more than a 4th grader.
Oh gosh.
And just like, I mean, that's something that has stayed with me. But the trauma of the children that have to hear the screams, the teachers that have to hear that going on and and not being able to intervene. And the flip side of that is I currently work at a school district where, and I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but like last year, there was a student that was having a very difficult time in the hallway. And rather than take that student, drag them through the hallways to a secluded room, like they just kind of made this protective barrier around him and allowed him to have his moment. Now, I don't know whether that's the right thing to do, but I felt, because I'd seen the exact opposite of that, I was like, I actually went to them and I said, thank you so much for not putting your hands on that student and
Mhm.
just like, and I just explained to my students because we were coming in from recess at the time. I said, everybody has bad days and,
Right.
they have their moments and he's, that's okay. He's just trying to get those emotions and those feelings out. There's more to that, students diagnosis or whatever. I'm not going to share that with my students and I'm not going to share that on the podcast. But I say that to say, when you were just telling, I just can't imagine the fear and trauma that instills in a child to have somebody that is 3, 4 times your weight holding you, keeping you from
Right. Right.
moving or speaking, or even if they're able to articulate, and usually, I mean, anybody that's in that fight or flight, is not really going to be able to verbalize, let alone if they're neurodivergent or
Right.
are
Right.
maybe nonverbal. You know what I'm
Right.
saying?
Right.
So,
Right.
like, I
Right.
could really feel your story about your
Right.
son as you were speaking, mainly because I'm an educator and I unfortunately have seen kind of the dark side of seclusion,
Sure. Sure.
restraint.
Yeah, and it absolutely can lead to lifelong trauma. I mean,
Absolutely.
I know kids that were 7 and 8 years old that were put in seclusion rooms that at 19 and 20 are afraid to sleep with their door shut at night or
100%.
afraid to get into an elevator. I know kids that are, children that were restrained or secluded when they were 8 or 9 years old that will drive by a school a decade later and get physically ill. And you brought up another really important point, and that is that these things, restraint and seclusion, um, they're traumatic not just for the child that's being physically restrained or secluded. It is traumatic for the staff. There is nothing at all pleasant about holding a child down or even dragging them off to a seclusion room.
No.
It is traumatic for the staff. It is traumatic for other students that witness it, and it can be traumatic for the families that have a child that are going through these things. And one of the things that I talk about a lot when I present is kind of this idea of kind of this trauma cycle that can follow us, because what we know about things like, and we can even expand it to the full gamut of restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. But what we know is that the kids that are more often subjected to these things are kids that already tend to have a trauma history.
Sure.
And we can look at the trauma that can come from various sources, but we also have to acknowledge there's a tremendous intersection with trauma and disability, trauma and neurodivergent. Being a neurodivergent individual in a neurotypical world, in a world that's not designed for you,
Right.
just going through life can be traumatic.
That's right.
And what we know is that people that have experienced a lot of trauma, of course, it changes the brain. And that's not being, figurative. I mean, there are changes that occur in the
Mhm.
structure and function of the brain
Mhm.
due to that, prolonged stress and trauma. And
Yes.
those changes we know lead to situations where individuals become hypervigilant.
Mhm.
And a hypervigilant kid or a hypervigilant adult for that matter are far more likely to have stress behaviors.
Yeah.
I'm not saying misbehaviors, bad behaviors. I'm saying stress behaviors. I don't feel safe. I don't feel secure, whatever it may be. And often what happens, and you've spent, a career in classrooms, and you've seen and experienced different things, and probably like all of us have gone through periods of growth and learning as you've gone. But I mean, what often happens is a dysregulated kid who is, having a behavior, oftentimes that behavior is met with compliance demands.
Mhm.
So child's having a hard time, we meet them with compliance demands. And very often through that process, as the adult is kind of pushing for compliance, the child escalates and escalates further. So you
Yes.
have a well-intentioned adult who unfortunately doesn't realize they're escalating the situation. And from there, it's a very small step to a fight or flight response.
Yes.
And the moment you put hands on any human being, if they weren't already in a fight or flight response, now
Mhm.
we've got one.
Yeah.
And when that fight or flight response happens and the kid is going to flail their arms and kick and spit and do whatever they need to do, very often in that situation, the adult gets hit. And what happens then? The adult goes into a fight or flight response mode.
Yeah.
And which makes this very unsafe. But what happens from there is, maybe there's a restraint, seclusion, or something else that happens. But what happens to follow that is, additional trauma, because, the restraint, the seclusion, the punitive, exclusionary discipline, those things lead to more trauma. So every time we go through
Yeah.
that loop, we're feeding that trauma cycle, making behavior more likely, not less likely. And the same holds true with the staff. The more the staff find themselves in a situation where, maybe they have to restrain a kid, the more likely they're going to feel unsafe. And if
Yeah.
they feel unsafe, they are more likely to go to an intervention like a restraint or seclusion that they have gone to before, even if they know cognitively it's not working.
Mhm.
Because we follow those pathways. We we're under stress, we're going to go down that pathway. I have to do this again. So you find these situations where entire schools don't use, something like a restraint or seclusion, just doesn't exist there. But then you'll find these pockets where
Mhm.
they're used heavily.
Mhm.
And the more they're being used, the more the staff are likely to use them, and the more the children are likely to end up having behaviors that get them used. So that cycle is really important to understand, that
Mhm.
trauma cycle.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So a word stood out to me in your bio on your website and several times when you've been speaking of the word punitive. Um, in religious trauma, we deal with, and a lot of times when people are questioning God and they're thinking about God, do I believe in a retributive God, punitive God,
Mhm.
or a restorative God? Do I believe in the one that's mean and kills people or pays people back,
Mhm.
or do I believe in the one that's restorative? Or how do I sort that out? And so we say a lot of times in our work, people have a deep need for connection.
Mhm,
I
mhm,
really
mhm.
like that the word attachment, the attachment and trauma network. But also, uh, you said during these, when it's being administered incorrectly, when it's punitive, then you said something about it separates or remove it removes that connection. And the
Mhm.
biggest thing he had was his special person or the
Right, right, right,
The
I
teacher,
can't
yeah.
remember what it's
Mhm.
called.
His
His
person.
person,
Mhm.
right, right.
and but he doesn't feel when she's not there. He doesn't feel attached. He's not.
Safe, right? And does it feel safe? Yeah.
But that thought process of punitive, restorative, retributive, I think it's going on in a lot of realms. I'm glad to see that there's someone like you in a position like you have doing the work you're doing.
Mhm.
Um, because politics will tell us we don't understand this across the board, and
Mhm,
we
mhm.
need this education. But can you hit a little bit harder just on what are the challenges for a kid on the spectrum or an adult on the spectrum, and what are the main ways we can help? In
Mhm,
case we get in a situation we didn't expect to be in,
mhm, mhm.
how can
Mhm.
all of us help? What are the things that what
Sure.
what are they like, and how do you help them?
Yeah. So, couple thoughts here. One is, if you look at, and I mentioned this before, but if you look at restraint seclusion as an example, and I shared that, more often than not, it's children with disabilities. If you look at federal data on restraint seclusion, 80% of restraints, 77% of seclusions, kids with disabilities. Whenever I have statewide data to look at, not all states have it. I typically find those numbers are about 95 to 98% children with disabilities. And I would share with you that there's a percentage that isn't represented there that are probably children that have yet to be identified as children with disabilities. So
Mhm.
overwhelmingly, things like restraint seclusion are done to children with disabilities. If we break that down a little further, one of the things that we'll find is that autistic children are far more likely to be restrained and secluded. um, Non-speaking autistic children more likely to be restrained and secluded.
Yeah.
In fact, I was looking at some data from one of the states. I think it was about 40% of the restraints were autistic children. Probably another large portion was children that fall under a emotional disturbance label, which I hate. I'm not a fan of that. We should call kids that have survived trauma survivors, not emotionally
Right.
disturbed.
Mhm.
Nonetheless, there's often even disparities in diagnoses that, and some of these happen along racial lines as well. You'll find that, two children that are, evaluated end up with different diagnoses. But nonetheless, I guess, you know, point one is, you're right in identifying that autistic children are more likely to find themselves here, and other neurodivergent children as well. Um, so, what might you do? And of course, that was one of the first questions that people asked me as I began to advocate, kind of to move away from restraint seclusion. And to be really clear, our position around restraint seclusion, we don't believe that the use of seclusion rooms is ever appropriate. We don't believe that putting a child against their will in a room and holding the door shut while they
Yeah.
scream in utter panic is ever something we should do. Those rooms can be really, really brutal.
Mhm.
And our thought is that restraint should be exceedingly rare. I mean, it should not be a common occurrence. If you only ever use the physical restraint in a situation that involved the threat of imminent serious physical harm, they would not be happening daily or even probably weekly in a school. They would be unusual.
Mhm.
And in some places, they're not. In some, they are. So the question of what to do instead is a question that drove me to begin looking for how do we better support the individuals that are being or more likely to be restrained and secluded. And that's where I began to find work from people like Dr. Ross Green, the collaborative proactive solutions model. Found work from people like Dr. Mona Delahook, who, of course, wrote a fantastic book called Beyond Behaviors. I think that much of what we need to do is really upstream. I'm a huge proponent of moving upstream. It's not just what do you do different in that moment that you got a really dysregulated kid. Yes, there are things we can do differently in that moment, but what we really want to do is avoid getting in that situation in the first place. And I happen to again be a big believer that when we are applying trauma-informed approaches, when we understand behavior through the lens of the brain and the nervous system, we look at behavior differently.
Yeah.
And when we look at behavior differently, we respond to behavior differently. So a lot of what we do today around behavior is not working for what I say are the kids that need help the most. That includes the children that you were talking about when you're saying autistic children. Well, those are often the kids that often need that help at a greater level, who aren't being well served by what we're doing. And what are we doing? We're doing the same things we've done for 100 years. We're doing a lot of work based on classical behaviorism, a lot of work based on operant conditioning, reward and consequence models. And the truth of the matter is that many of these things are not working. Even even when we look at the more positive, realm of these things, rewards. People often use a lot of reward-based systems. I can tell you from the many families that I've supported, some of the things that have led to restraint seclusion have been reward programs. When a kid doesn't earn the thing they really, really worked hard to earn, you get a really dysregulated kid.
Right.
So, a lot of the things that we're not doing right now aren't working. So I'm a big believer that when we can help people understand behavior through the lens of the brain and the nervous system. So what do I mean by that? People often say behavior is communication. I'll nod my head. I agree. But above that, behavior is biology. There's a whole lot beyond behavior than, again, I realize people have different experiences and different backgrounds. I'm not a huge proponent of kind of the typical assessments of behavior that look at all behavior through the lens of attention seeking, avoiding, escape. Those are often vast oversimplifications of what's really going on below the surface. And when you look at behavior through the lens of the brain and nervous system, you begin to understand what's happening. You begin to understand brain development. Our brains develop in a very specific way over a period of time. Often as adults, we look at kids and we expect them to have all the capabilities in their cortex that we have. They don't have that. And they won't for many, many years. I mean, 25, 30 years old, individually, it's going to be different. So, to me, the answer to your question now, first of all, I mean, I always like to say, and I don't remember who to attribute it to, but if you meet one autistic child, you met one autistic child, right?
Yeah.
Everyone is different. However, we share the need for safety and connection. And so much of this work begins with safety and connection. And, Bruce Perry's work, the neurosequential model, Bruce Perry talks about regulate, relate, reason, kind of this model of the brain, neurosequential, neurobrain, sequential order, talking about how, we can't use that logical, rational part of our brain when we're dysregulated,
That's
right?
right.
So I think that a lot of this, what you do instead, is not necessarily about changing kids. Some of it's about changing the adult mindsets, expectations, and approaches around behavior. Now, of course, in the heat of the moment, what do you do differently?
Mhm.
Sometimes it goes against your instincts. Sometimes it's a matter of taking a step back, making yourself smaller, using a calming voice.
Mhm.
Sometimes rather than rushing towards a child to hold them or contain them in some way, it's doing the opposite.
Mhm.
So at any rate, I think to your question, there are a lot of things that we can do differently. Certainly, there are things that we can do differently in the moment that we've got something happening. But a lot of this work in terms of creating better outcomes for kids, for teachers, and for families, because I believe here that the same things that we can do to improve outcomes for our kids that we're talking about here will actually improve the outcomes for the teachers, staff, and families.
Mhm.
Same things. So to me, a lot of this work is that upstream work. I always quote Desmond Tutu. It's the quote about rather than pulling people out of the river, we need to go upstream and figure out why they're falling in.
Mm.
Brain science can help us figure out why people are falling in to some degree.
Mm.
Why are they having that big behavior? Lead with curiosity. Stuart Shanker, Dr. Stuart Shanker, who I think very highly of, developed a program called Self-Reg, looks at stress, looks at regulation of the nervous system, dives deeply into brain science. Dr. Shanker says a couple things that really always resonate with me. One of them is, being curious, asking questions, and it's the why and why now. Why am I seeing this? Why am I seeing it now?
Mhm.
The other is this idea that when we see a child differently, we see a different child.
Mm.
And when we can begin to see children differently and stop focusing on the behavior and start trying to understand the why,
Mhm.
start trying to figure out how do we better support them? Where's this coming from? I think we make a lot of positive change.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I guess what is it, $1 million question is like, how do we, you spoke a little bit to the fact that as humans, we kind of just fall back on what we know, right? And so I guess the big question is, I decided to dig into trauma informed, trauma responsive classrooms kind of on my own, and
Mhm.
really I'm very passionate about it now. But how do we get more educators, more even parents? I
Right.
mean,
Yep.
because if
Yep.
you think about it, it's not just necessarily, when you're talking about corporal punishment, that's not just something that might happen in schools. I mean, sometimes that is something that happens in the home, and restraint
Still
could
far more
also,
common. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
right? Restraint could also have. So, how do we educate people out of like falling back into what they always have done?
Right. Right.
Because I have to catch myself. I really do. When I first started in education, I was, a raise your voice kind of teacher, and
Got to
almost,
assert your authority, right? Yeah.
right, assert your authority
Right.
and call kids out,
Right.
like, I think back
Yeah.
on it, I'm just like, I try to give myself some grace because I didn't know what I didn't know, but now that I
Right.
know, I want to do better.
Right.
But,
Right. Right.
you know,
And that's the key.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, but even still today, with knowing what I know about being trauma informed, trauma responsive, I still have to, like you said, still have to stop. I have to get small. But how can we, how can we help teachers that are maybe struggling in that area, or
Mhm.
parents that are
Mhm. Mhm.
struggling
Right.
to, I don't know if I'm making any sense.
You well, you
Clean that up.
yeah. I mean, you're making a lot of sense, and I mean, this is not easy, and
Mm.
change is hard.
Yes.
I'm gonna make a guess here, and I'm 99% sure that I'll be right. Um, like me, you didn't grow up being taught about your brain and your nervous system and what how to be aware of the sensations and feelings you have in your body.
Right.
You didn't grow up that way,
No.
and you may have grown up. As I did. I mean, in a more punitive, kind of household. I mentioned part one of my story, and I won't go into a lot of detail there, but I spent some time in private religious schools. I was subjected to corporal punishment when I was very young. Um, I remember it very well, and maybe there's a little part of that feeds into my justice drive today for some of this. But I think change is really difficult, and we've got to start by just making some progress. You said something, and it reminded me of the other quote that I use in every presentation, which is Maya Angelou, right? Which is a quote about do the best you can until you know better, do better. This work is not about judging or blaming or shaming. This is about there's an opportunity. We know better now. We actually do know better collectively. Now, we may not individually all know better, but have an open mind and heart and be willing to know better, be willing to go on a journey. And I think many are. But change is hard and some are resistant. You know that. You work in education.
Yes,
You'll
yes.
find that if you bring in a new idea, you're going to have some people that are ready to jump on board, others that you'll never bring on board, and others that are, going to wait and see how things go. That kind of change is difficult. But I think we need to start by bringing some of these things into our schools, teaching our families. I mentioned Lori Desautel's earlier. I've had the opportunity to work with Lori for many years. One of Lori's been on my podcast more than I think anybody else. One of the events we did together that really always sticks in my mind is an event we did with a school she was working with. And we had, I think, a principal, administrator, teacher, and a couple classroom teachers and students. And one of the students was sharing what she had learned. Zamika, I think her name was. She was sharing some of the things that she had learned through Lori's teaching and through the program. And, learning about kind of her amygdala and what it was like to feel dysregulated. And then she talked about a favorite strategy she had if she was becoming dysregulated. And then she shared that she was sharing these things with her family. And that gave me a lot of hope, because I think that there's an opportunity through our children to inform our adults.
Absolutely.
So there are, of course, individuals and organizations that are doing work that are trying to push in this direction. So, how do we make this change? The Attachment Trauma Network. We connect it through the Attachment Trauma Network, right? A great organization that every year holds a conference, the Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools Conference. If you are a parent, find the link to the Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools Conference and send it to your teacher, send it to your administrator, share these things. If you are a educator, think about going. We need to kind of get people moving in this direction. We also have a challenge because there is still a tremendous amount of bad advice out there, both for parenting and for education. A lot of it based on some of the things we've already talked about. And it's still really prevalent. There's a lot of people that have ideas around this that I believe are really entrenched in kind of past ideology that we should be beyond, but it's out there and it's still really prevalent. So I think, part of the challenge here is, beginning with ourselves, moving in a better direction, encouraging others to move into a better direction. And, ultimately, I think there's opportunities to show the success of this work. So, you've talked about your own journey, and I'm going to guess here that in that journey, as you look at it, you think, oh gosh, I wish I'd known what I knew now back then.
Yeah.
Right.
We need to do more to spread that. We also have an issue, I believe, that needs some more solutions around higher ed. Our higher ed programs are still lagging.
Yeah.
Higher ed can lag 10, 20 years behind sometimes. And I think some of our higher ed programs are lagging behind. Lori has a fantastic program at Butler University in applied educational neuroscience. The people that I meet, I get to guest lecture for that every year, and I really enjoy that. But the people that I meet that are part of that program, they are amazing people, and they are aligned with a lot of these things that we're talking about today. And they are change makers. They are disruptors. And we need disruptors. We need people that are pushing change. In fact, I'm not undressing here, so don't worry. But I think I've got one of my shirts on underneath here that's about making good trouble, right? So, one of the things that we have to do is we have to disrupt systems. We have to make good trouble. We have to kind of really not only believe these things, but look for ways that we can adjust systems and make change.
Well, now I need that T-shirt.
Yeah. That's from John. What's his name?
Oh,
So anyway,
yeah.
So for the benefit of our audience, I want to go back and look at trauma just a little bit more. So trauma, I'm gonna give you my basic understanding, and I tend to kind of stay there, kind of at a, explain it to me simply, kind of. But trauma, because a lot of people almost immediately dismiss that and say, well, you're talking about getting your feelings hurt at church, or you're talking about, you know, just an excuse for your bad behavior because you're sinful. There's all of that stuff that goes around. But trauma, yeah, in my understanding, trauma is an event that happened and that we interpreted a certain way because we couldn't regulate it ourselves, we couldn't help ourselves, or our caregiver wasn't there at the right time, or somebody actually hurt us, physically hurt us. We couldn't do anything about it, and maybe we couldn't flee, and those kind of things. So that trauma gets stored in our nervous system. We say, the body keeps the score.
Yep.
Right.
Bessel van der Kolk. Yep.
Right.
Body
So,
keeps the score. Yep.
so there's trauma. Then later on, maybe in my life, when something similar happens, it triggers me. We use that word a lot. And then I experience this kind of in a root brain way, in a lower brain way. So in my classic example would be my wife and I are all of a sudden in an argument over nothing. And we don't know where it came from and how that
True
started
story sometimes.
over and over and over again.
That's really happened.
That'll be an interesting show.
But instead of being able to be with that trauma, and to sense it in our body and to take some time with it, we react instead of respond to it. And trauma informed has a lot to do with just understanding kind of those basic things that, and now we've had the privilege to look at some somatic healing and things we did, one with the Benedictine sisters, that really helped us get in touch with our body, and we could regulate, and we could shift that trauma almost a little bit. And we're so excited about that. It's really hard to communicate with people. And so is that what you mean by trauma informed? That we kind of get to a place where we've invested the time to understand those things.
Right. And of course there's a whole spectrum of terminology that can be used from, kind of trauma informed to trauma sensitive, and there's specific meaning there. But I think that all of this begins with understanding the impact that trauma can have. And in explaining this, we're talking about, sometimes people are dismissive, like, oh, well, that was done to me and I'm fine, oh yeah, I got hit as a kid, but I turned out fine. And it's like, well,
Right.
did you really? Are you sure? Because right now you're advocating to hit children, so you really think you turned out okay? And the truth of the matter is that we're very individualized. You and I could experience the exact same thing, and it could result in something that might be very traumatic for you and maybe not very traumatic for me. We all have kind of a different range of experiences and how they impact us. Some individuals have, I think, a more sensitive threat detection system. Dr. Stephen Porges talks about neuroception, kind of this idea that our bodies are always taking in information and sensations, and that kind of equates to cues of threat and cues of safety. And individuals that have experienced a lot of trauma don't feel safe sometimes in situations that subjectively everyone else would say we're safe. Or as a teacher, you've certainly heard and maybe even said at one time or another, like, well, that just came out of nowhere. There was something happening below the surface. So trauma, I think the important thing about trauma is understanding, one, what it is, and again, there's a tendency for people to get dismissive because they've heard the word a lot lately, right? So
Yeah.
oh, I'm so traumatized. Well, understanding the way that trauma reshapes our brain, reshapes our experiences. You got really close to a quote that I love, which is kind of like this idea that trauma comes back as a reaction, not a memory. Thinking about Bruce Perry's work again, I think it was The Boy That Was Raised as a Dog. He talks about trauma and shares a story, and I'm probably going to get it a little wrong, but kind of imagine for a second somebody that had been abused, and they're sitting in a classroom, and somebody walks in wearing a cologne that is the same cologne as the person that abused them. They don't stop and think, What's that smell? It's the cologne that so and so wore. I don't feel safe. It comes back as a response, as a reaction, and it is their body. Their body is sensing that situation. So I think it's being trauma informed is about understanding the impact of trauma, understanding how trauma can change your brain, then understanding what we can do. I mean, the basis for helping individuals that have experienced a lot of trauma. You mentioned some specific approaches and interventions, and there's a lot of things that you can do. I've heard people that have been very successful with things like EMDR or the Safe and Sound protocol. So there's a lot of things out there that people might do, but it starts with connection. You know, having co-regulation. We often have expectations, especially when it comes to children, that aren't developmentally appropriate, that we expect kids to be able to self-regulate when they don't even really have the capability yet of learning that and knowing how to do it. So back to your question, I mean, I think ultimately understanding trauma is about understanding how these lived experiences, and we can go back to things like the adverse childhood experiences study that was done over 20 years ago, and there was some real long-term science that looked at how these adverse experiences could lead down the road to long-term health issues, that could lead down the road to attachment issues and a whole host of other things. So I think it's important. I mean, being trauma informed is about first understanding what trauma is, how it affects individuals, and then what we can do to better support people through that trauma informed lens. Because applying a trauma informed lens to anyone can be advantageous.
Yeah, so I like the words that I've seen several times. I just write words on my page when I'm listening to someone, and I heard relationships a lot, and you said connections there at the end. Also, I think it's so important, and like everything I learn, I want to go on a crusade and tell everybody what I know, and they're not always ready to hear it. Sometimes, but I just want to sound the whistle to everyone I can that I was a pastor for 20 years and I didn't get better in 20 years, and I didn't understand what I needed to understand to get better. And because I didn't get better, I got worse. And my fear about all of that is that I influenced other people to not do or do the same that I was doing. So I kind of get maybe too serious about it every once in a while, but it's urgent. And the thing about punishment and things like that is it's a quick solution. It works for a short time. It works right now, but it doesn't necessarily do anything for us long term. Relationships, connections, that kind of stuff. When you start talking about that, that's long term work. It's
Absolutely.
hard.
And giving ourselves grace, I think, is really important. So as I'm listening to you, I can hear you, still kind of feeling some, some personal struggle there,
Sure.
but I think giving ourselves grace and again, really applying that idea to ourselves, do the best you can until you know better, and then better, do better. I mean, when you look through that lens, I think you can kind of be forgiving and say, you know what, I didn't know better then, but I know better now. And I think anything that we can do to help other people on that journey, I think we have an obligation to. I mean, I think this is what led me to quit my job and take a very uncertain step into a unknown direction, was feeling like it's not just knowing better and doing better. We're like, better. It's like we have an obligation to do better. We have an obligation, I think, as people to connect and help and make a positive dent in the world.
Yeah, for sure. How would people get a hold of you if they want to reach out to you?
Sure. So, of course, the organization, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, if you Google the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, you will find us. We have a website, which is endseclusion.org. We're on probably most social media platforms that you might imagine that we would be on. Seems like there's a new one every week, but we're on social media. And of course, people can reach out to me via email as well, guy@endseclusion.org. Always happy to, always happy to chat with people. Always happy to see if there's anything we can do to help or support them in any situation that might be going through.
Yeah. Okay, good. So and we'll do that. We always ask people one question that we never give them any advance warning about in this. So not that we gave you advance warning of any of the things we're going to ask you today, but this one we say, what would you put on your billboard if you had a billboard that everybody could see? And Laura says it can be as long as you want. I said, well, you can't cause car accidents, but it's usually pretty direct. But what would be that thing that you would want to tell the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's tough. There's a couple things that come to mind immediately. I'm just going to simplify and say, do better. I mean, it gets back to the Angelo quote, but I mean, I think that there's always an opportunity for us to do better for ourselves and do better for others. So I'm just going to keep it billboard length and say, do better.
Yeah.
And that's not being judgmental.
Yeah.
That's just kind of hopefully inspirational, like we can do better.
While we're still on the air, you mentioned the Attachment and Trauma Network, trauma sensitive schools, conferences coming up. We'll put information in the notes about this, but all of us will be there, right?
I'm not sure if I'm going to be there this year. I'm not. So I've been the last 3 years, and I generally try to go. But at the time I was planning, the time for the conference, I wasn't in a position that I was able to commit to it for some other obligations. So okay. I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to be there or not, but it is a fantastic conference. I really recommend it for educators, for social workers, for therapists, for administrators. It really is a great conference. And I know there's a great agenda this year as well. Yeah. We're also doing a small virtual conference in January 20th. It's called Supporting All Brains. And it's about kind of the intersection of, neurodiversity-affirming and neuroscience, how to better support all kids. So that might be another opportunity people are interested in as well.
For our listeners out there, we really appreciate you. We appreciate you tuning in and taking the time to understand a new topic this month that we talk about some, but these experts are talking about in a little more detail, in a little more specialized way. We appreciate you tuning in. And as always, be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary podcast.
Remember, all who wander in the desert are not lost.
We believe all of our stories are sacred.
We are always here if you need someone to hear your story.
Check out our blog on Pathos and also our YouTube channel.
And stay tuned for our Leaning Forward conference.
Remember, we love you.
And be at peace.